It is the night of February 13th, 1945. Location: the sky above Dresden, Germany. Altitude: 26,000 feet. The air is a freezing, empty void, yet it vibrates with the deep, monotonous drone of hundreds of engines. Inside the fuselage of a B-17 flying fortress, Staff Sergeant Tom Harris grips his twin .50 caliber machine guns, his breath fogging the plexiglass. Below them, Dresden, a jewel box of Baroque architecture, waits in ignorant darkness. They are about to flip a switch that will ignite a continent. For years, the German Reich had defied gravity. It had turned back the tide of history, first with lightning-fast tanks, then with jets that were the envy of the world. But by the winter of 1945, the war had become a battle of simple arithmetic, a war the Allies were winning with relentless, brutal efficiency. The German defenses, once a fearsome shield of flak and skilled fighter pilots, were exhausted, fractured, and staring into an abyss. They possessed the ghosts of innovation, but the Allies commanded the relentless engine of industry. The central irony of this final phase of the air war is this: Germany had placed its faith in sophisticated high-performance fighters, the Messerschmitt Me-262 and the Focke-Wulf Fu-190. They were scalpels, but the Allies were using a sledgehammer. The sheer industrial output of the United States, thousands of B-17s, B-24s and B-29s rolling off assembly lines like cars, meant that for every German ace lost, 5 new trained American crews arrived. Voice of Lieutenant Hans Müller, Luftwaffe pilot, 1945. We were told the Me-262 was the miracle weapon. We saw its speed, its cannon. It was a masterpiece. But how do you fight 1,000 enemies? We flew missions where the sky was literally black with their bombers. It was not a dogfight. It was a surrender to numbers. The weight of this strategic bombing campaign was borne not just by the bombers, but by the fighter escorts, chief among them the rugged P-51 Mustang. With its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and sleek aerodynamic design, the P-51 could ride herd over the bomber stream all the way to Berlin and back. It wasn't just fast, it had range, and range ultimately broke the Luftwaffe's back. Prior to the P-51, German fighters could engage the bombers knowing the escorting P-47s would soon be forced to turn back due to fuel. Now, the skies belonged to the Americans from start to finish. In 1944, German industry produced approximately 40,000 aircraft, an impressive number seemingly, yet their fighter pilot training pipeline had been decimated. The average operational flight hours of a newly minted German pilot had plummeted from around 200 hours early in the war to less than 50 hours by early 1945. They had machines, but no experienced men to fly them. Conversely, the Allied strategy was moving from precision to obliteration. The introduction of incendiary clusters and high-explosive blockbusters was changing the very nature of air warfare. The mission over Dresden was a perfect demonstration, a massive, coordinated attack designed to create the infamous firestorm. Staff Sergeant Harris, thousands of feet above the earth, knew only the chilling task at hand. The primary target was the rail yard, but the psychological and industrial intent went far beyond a few tracks. It was about creating an inferno that would collapse the infrastructure, the morale, and the very will of the enemy. The sheer audacity of sending this volume of aircraft into the heart of the Reich in daylight, or even this deeply at night, signaled a confidence, an arrogance that was historically unprecedented. The P-51s, flown by the likes of the legendary 4th Fighter Group, hunted the remaining German formations with clinical precision. They not only shot down the enemy, but they enforced the freedom of the skies that allowed the bombers to arrive in waves of destruction virtually unopposed. By 1945, a German pilot needed not only exceptional skill, but exceptional luck to survive a single sortie. Voice of Staff, Sergeant Tom Harris, B-17 gunner, 1945. You could smell the air change, even at 26,000 feet. Not the smoke, but the fear. You saw the puffs of flak getting thinner, weaker. We knew they were running out of everything: fuel, ammunition, men. They were shooting ghosts, and we were the reality. The final act of the air war was not fought with revolutionary technology, but with the brutal arithmetic of aluminum, high-octane fuel, and relentless manpower. The ghost of Rheinmetall, the great industrial giant of the Reich, was haunted by the roar of the American engine. The coming chapters will peel back the layers of this collapse. The technological desperation of the German High Command, the psychological trauma on the ground, and the precise tactical shift that turned aerial superiority into total air dominance. But as we transition, consider this. The sheer scale of this effort, the thousands of young lives staked on a single run over a distant city, demands our attention and respect. If this deep dive into the true cost of industrial warfare resonates with you, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're just getting started. The strategic bombing campaign did not win the war alone, but by 1945, it had created the essential precondition for victory, the total collapse of German mobility and production. This was the era of the arithmetic of annihilation, where the decisive factor was not innovation, but simple, overwhelming quantity. Let's look at the numbers that shattered the German industrial backbone. The key Allied strategy became the targeting of oil and transportation. Germany relied heavily on synthetic fuel production from plants like Leuna and Pöhlitz. The destruction of these facilities was a death blow more effective than any single battlefield victory. In June 1944, German synthetic fuel production peaked at 315,000 tons. By September 1944, after relentless Allied attacks, production had plummeted to just 17,000 tons, a catastrophic loss of over 94%. Voice of Albert Speer, German Minister of Armaments and War Production, 1945. The attacks on the oil plants were the mortal blow. It meant we had magnificent tanks, superb aircraft, but they were all parked. We had the men, but they were immobile. The war was lost, not on the factory floor, but in the oil drums. This crippling fuel shortage had immediate devastating consequences for the Luftwaffe. Pilots could no longer be properly trained. Me-262 jet pilots, the only remaining realistic defense against the bombers, were flying missions on fumes, and often crashed due to fuel exhaustion rather than enemy fire. The fuel crisis grounded the very machines that might have turned the tide. The Allies, meanwhile, were masters of standardization and mass production. The B-17 and the B-24 Liberator were the workhorses. The B-17 was renowned for its legendary ruggedness, capable of absorbing hundreds of hits and still bringing its crew home, a psychological weapon in itself. The B-24 carried a larger bomb load, capable of delivering a greater punch per sortie. Together they constituted a relentless conveyor belt of destruction. The average American bomber crew completed a full tour of duty, typically 25-30 missions, by 1945, a statistic unthinkable earlier in the war. This was due to vastly superior escort protection and the degradation of the German defense. The survival rate, while still brutal, was a testament to the fact that the odds were finally tipping. The precision needed for the strategic bombing was often sacrificed for area bombing, particularly by the RAF at night and increasingly by the USAAF as the war intensified. The rationale was simple. When a target like a rail junction is surrounded by factories, housing, and infrastructure, an area attack destroys the entire ecosystem of war production. The shift in ordnance was critical. The use of AN-M50 series incendiary bombs, especially in the M47 cluster, created localized firestorms. These were not just fires. They were self-sustaining meteorological events, pulling in oxygen at ferocious speeds, generating superheated winds, and often creating temperatures exceeding 1,000 Celsius. The German flak defenses, the formidable 80mm anti-aircraft gun, were also running short of trained personnel and ammunition. Towards the end of the war, teenagers and elderly men, designated as Flakhelfer, manned the critical defenses. Their aim was erratic, their morale low, and their training inadequate. The great steel umbrella over the Reich was full of holes. Voice of Flakhelfer Werner Richter, 16 years old, Dresden, 1945. I was 16. We knew the sound of the American planes, a deep, endless rumble, like the earth groaning. We fired the 88s, but they flew so high they looked like silver specks. We were aiming at the sky, but the real enemy was fear. You felt so small against that endless roar. This asymmetry, unlimited resources, trained crews, and overwhelming numbers on one side versus technological ghosts, no fuel, and exhausted teenagers on the other, is the chilling arithmetic that defined the collapse. The Allies didn't need a single superweapon, they just needed to keep the assembly lines running. The steady, predictable delivery of destruction was the ultimate weapon of 1945. If the story of the collapse has a tragic technological hero, it is the Messerschmitt Me 262 Schwalbe, Swallow. It was a machine that rewrote the laws of aerial combat, a true harbinger of the jet age. But it was born into a doomed war. The Me 262 was powered by two Junkers Jumo Ur-4 axial-flow turbojet engines. At full throttle, it could reach speeds exceeding 540 mph, 870 km/h, leaving even the fastest P-51 in its dust. Its armament, four powerful 30mm Mk108 cannon, could carve a B-17 in half with a short burst. This was the aircraft that terrified the Allied commanders. Had it been deployed a year earlier, and in sufficient numbers, the strategic bombing campaign might have been impossible. But its development was plagued by Hitler's strategic blunders, insisting the jet be used as a high-speed bomber, and by the sheer difficulty of mass-producing its complex engines under continuous bombardment. Voice of General Karl Spaatz, Commander, U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe. The jet was a clear and present danger. It was the only thing that gave me sleepless nights. If they had 1,000 of those things, we'd have been forced to rethink everything. Thank God they didn't have the fuel and they didn't have the time. The Allied response to the Me 262 was not to build a faster jet, though they rushed development of the P-80 Shooting Star, but to develop a highly effective counter-tactic, the Hunters. The P-51 Mustang pilots, the little friends of the bomber crews, became masters of the low-altitude ambush. The jet's great weakness was its slow acceleration and poor maneuverability during takeoff and landing. The Allies learned to patrol the airfields where the Me-262s operated, such as Riem and Jagel, waiting for the moment of maximum vulnerability. The P-51s and P-47s would attack the jets with their 6 50-caliber machine guns, the M2 Browning, often engaging from the rear where the jet's speed advantage was minimized. They hunted them relentlessly during their fuel-critical approach and climbing-out phases. The Allied pilots knew that one destroyed jet on the ground saved dozens of bomber crews in the air. This tactical superiority was matched by a vast technological gap in production quality. The German jet engines, due to material shortages, particularly nickel and cobalt for high-temperature turbine blades, and hurried construction, often had a service life of only 10 to 25 operating hours. The Allied piston engines, in contrast, were robust and reliable. The German response, as their situation grew desperate, included bizarre and radical designs. The Bachenbach 349 Natter rocket-powered interceptor, designed to launch vertically and destroy bombers with a single, massive salvo of rockets before the pilot parachuted out. This was not strategy. It was a Hail Mary pass, a sign of total defeat in the conventional air war. The experience of the final German pilots was one of intense, isolated dread. They often flew without wingmen, without ground control radar support, the vast German radar network having been neutralized, and without hope of reinforcement. Their missions were suicide runs, undertaken not for victory, but for a fading sense of duty. Voice of Lieutenant Klaus Zimmermann, Me 262 pilot, 1945. The cockpit was cold. We took off alone. Below us, the Allied P-51s were always there, waiting like hungry wolves near the runway. We had the fastest aircraft in the world, but we were targets in a shooting gallery. You knew you had perhaps 10 minutes of fuel for the fight, and then you were praying. The Me 262 was a magnificent technological achievement, but history proves that a superior weapon is useless without the superior industrial base, the fuel, and the command structure to support it. The German genius for innovation was ultimately crushed by the American genius for mass production and logistical efficiency. It was a technological tragedy played out in the skies over a dying Reich. The narrative of the final collapse is not just about machines, it is about the human experience of terror, the weaponization of psychological warfare on a scale never before seen. The firestorm was the ultimate expression of this terror. The attacks on cities like Hamburg, Kassel, Pforzheim, and most infamously Dresden were designed to eliminate not just production, but the workforce, the morale, and the administrative capacity to wage war. The pattern was often the same. The first wave, usually the RAF at night, dropped high-explosive HE bombs to blow out roofs, windows, and create debris to hamper firefighting efforts. The second wave, hours later, dropped massive quantities of incendiary bombs. The effect was calculated. The combination of dense housing, high explosives creating ventilation, and thousands of localized fires fusing into a single conflagration created a deadly vacuum. The air superheated, rushed upwards, and pulled massive volumes of fresh air into the center of the city at gale force speeds. The firestorm. Temperatures could melt glass and asphalt. Humans caught outside were incinerated. Those in shelters often suffocated as the fire sucked the oxygen from the bunkers. Voice of Dr. Eleanor Brandt, Dresden Citizen, 1945. It was not fire, it was a wind of fire. You couldn't run against it. My neighbor tried to leave the shelter, and the heat was so intense, his clothes caught fire instantly. We stayed below ground, but the air was just gone. We were suffocating in the dark. The city above us was boiling. The immediate result was an appalling loss of life, but the strategic effect was the total collapse of the civilian support structure for the war effort. Workers stopped showing up to the factories. Rail yards and telephone exchanges were obliterated. The administrative structure of the Nazi Party in these regions ceased to function. For the German soldier on the eastern and western fronts, the news filtering back was devastating. The home front was no longer safe. Their families were exposed to an invisible, relentless enemy from the sky. This constant, unanswerable threat eroded the core fighting spirit that had sustained the Wehrmacht for years. On the Allied side, the psychological toll was also immense. Bomber crews faced the moral dilemma of their mission. They were, in a sense, executioners. While officially bombing military targets, the reality of the destruction below was undeniable. Voice of Captain Mark Dusty Rhodes, B-17 pilot, 1945. We were told we were saving lives, that every factory we hit shortened the war by a day. That made sense in the briefing room. But when you looked down and saw an entire city disappear under a sheet of flame, you felt small. It was necessary, maybe, but it wasn't glorious. It was just awful. The sheer weight of the Allied forces further amplified this feeling of hopelessness. By early 1945, the 8th Air Force was capable of putting over 1,500 heavy bombers and 1,000 fighter escorts into the air for a single mission. The Germans could barely muster a few hundred operational fighters, and those were often scattered to defend key oil facilities. The Allies were not just winning the air war, they were imposing a total blockade from above. Food, fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements could not move without risk of attack. Highways, bridges, and inland waterways became death traps. The collapse of morale was systemic. It wasn't one single event, but a relentless accumulation of devastation, the endless rain of bombs, the constant scream of the air raid siren, the lack of sleep, and the knowledge that every new German technological marvel, from the V-2 rocket to the Me-262 jet, had arrived too late to stop the inevitable. The once proud and disciplined German war machine was choking on its own ruins. The ultimate proof of the collapse did not come with the fall of Berlin, but months earlier, in a small, desperate maneuver. In March 1945, the Luftwaffe attempted one final, massive defense of the synthetic fuel plants in the Ruhr Valley. They committed virtually every remaining operational fighter in the West. The 8th Air Force arrived with nearly 1,400 bombers and a full complement of escorts. The resulting air battle was a massacre. The Germans lost dozens of irreplaceable pilots and aircraft, and the bombing targets were still hit with devastating accuracy. It was the final, formal surrender of the sky. The surrender of the German High Command on May 8, 1945, marked the end of the war in Europe. But the true victor of the final months was not a soldier on the ground, but the anonymous factory worker in Detroit. The legacy of the collapse under the incendiary bombing is threefold. 1. The triumph of industrial capacity. The war proved that in the 20th century, the capacity to produce aircraft, fuel, and ordnance on an unimaginable scale was the decisive strategic weapon. The United States alone produced over $300,000 aircraft during the war, dwarfing the combined Axis production. This industrial might ensured that for every German weapon, there were 10 Allied answers. 2. The shift in air power doctrine. The final campaigns irrevocably altered military thinking. The doctrine of strategic bombing was cemented as a critical component of modern warfare, designed to cripple an enemy's ability to fight before the armies ever meet. It was a terrifying glimpse into the future of war, where the non-combatant population became a central target. 3. The birth of the Cold War air race. The technological fallout of the collapse immediately fueled the next global conflict. The very technology the Germans had failed to deploy, the jet engine and the intercontinental rocket, were scooped up by the victorious Allies. The Me-262 was foundational to the American P-80 and the Soviet MiG-9. The German V-2 rocket, developed by Werner von Braun, became the blueprint for the entire US and Soviet missile programs. The collapse of the Third Reich's air defense was the dramatic prelude to the terrifying global missile race of the Cold War. The human legacy, however, remains the most indelible. The air war of 1945 was an experience of raw existential terror for those on the ground. For the Allied airmen, it was an act of brutal necessity, flown in conditions of unimaginable stress. Voice of General Henry H. Hap Arnold, commanding general of the U.S. Army Air Forces. The air war saved us from 1 million more casualties on the ground. We bombed Germany out of the war. It was terrible, yes, but it was swift, and the enemy could not answer. The scars of the incendiary campaigns remain etched on the German landscape and memory. The collapse of the German defenses in 1945 was not a sudden breaking point, but the final, inevitable crunch of a highly sophisticated military machine under the ceaseless, crushing weight of superior industrial arithmetic and relentless air power. The roar of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine over the ruined cities of Germany became the sound of the ultimate, irreversible defeat. The untold stories of the engineers, the civilians, and the pilots caught in this final inferno are a testament to the extremes of human endurance and the devastating power of the industrial age. Their experiences are far more complex than simple victory and defeat. If the stories of these strategic and human dramas of World War II, captured by the camera and the microphone, resonate with you, remember to like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe to our channel for more deep-dive historical analysis. What other collapse of a World War II power do you think deserves this level of detailed examination? Let us know in the comments below.